Hi, everyone. It's Mr. Williams. So we've been talking a lot about the causes of the French and Indian War in class, and we've talked about what led to the conflict and ultimately, you know, um, some of the factors that led to the British victory. We did that today with the reading, yesterday, which would be Wednesday. I'm recording this Wednesday night, but we need to look and focus on the end of the war. And that starts with the Treaty of Paris, which was signed between France and Britain in 1763, which officially ended the conflict globally, because this war was fought not only in North America, but it was fought in Europe, the Caribbean, and Asia. Okay, so this was very much a global contest between two major imperial powers. Okay, and so if we look at what were some of these themes, um, in terms of what the end result is, first of all, we have France gave up most claims to North America. So essentially everything from, Canada all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, east of the Mississippi River, now belongs to Britain. Okay. France was able to keep some land in the Caribbean, there's Sugar Islands, but in terms of North American land claims, it's pretty much all gone. Britain now has Canada and the eastern half of the Mississippi Valley, and I will show you a visual for what that looks like in just a minute. Okay, so essentially what that means is the British colonial holdings doubled. Their land claims in North America have now doubled, which is going to be a good thing, but it's also going to be a very concerning thing when it comes to money and protection and all that kind of stuff. And then lastly, this is the one of all four of these. This is the one that we're going to have to focus on the most, because it really has the biggest impact of what's going to happen next between Britain and its American colonies. Okay, you have a fortune spent to fight the war, which nearly bankrupts its economy, and we're talking about it. If you're talking about modern money, we're talking about $27 billion. A lot of money that was borrowed, a lot of money that was spent. The national debt has doubled in Britain, and they're in dire straits. And for a powerful nation who now has more land to their, name, that's a good thing that they have all this land, but it came at a significant price. Okay. So if we look at the map here, and we have, it says right here, North America after the French and Indian War, you can see everything in pink right here is gains from Britain from 1763. And you can notice, you just see this huge area of land that goes all the way to the Mississippi River, which is there's the river right there. So that's significant. Okay. And you notice here also that Britain is going to gain what was then called Spanish Florida. And that's not going to be a huge concern at the moment, because we're not going to talk about mass settlement, and eventually Spain will regain that territory back. But they do get, Canada. They got a lot of these areas were French settlements, like Quebec and Montreal, okay, along the St. Lawrence River here. But of all the things on this map, the area that we need to focus on here is this Indian Reserve of 1763. Everything that's inside this like greenish yellow, kind of ugly color shaded area, because it's really everything just to the west of this border of the original 13 colonies going into the Ohio River Valley and territory that would be beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Okay. And really by 1763, this had become desirable land to be settled on, because settlers were eager to push west. They wanted to be able to have the ability to not just be isolated on the coast. And let's face it, the farmland in this region, the good farmland, is really spoken for by this time. Okay. Especially along the coastal regions in the South, near these port cities like Charleston and Savannah, you're not going to be able to find large amounts of really good farmland. So you're going to have to look to push west. And that's going to become a theme from this point forward. But there's a problem here, because if you look here on this map, it says Indian Reserve. Okay. And so essentially what happens is we are talking about an area that is basically going to be set aside for Native Americans. Many of the Americans whom were fighting with the British during the war as allies, and many of which fought against the British during the war, who were allies with France. So it's a little bit of both, but there's a reason behind this, and we're going to get to that in just a second. Okay. And so we need to look at the consequences of the war, because one of the things we've talked about, and it was mentioned in the video clip, is that this is a very consequential war. We focus much more on the end result than we do the cause. Okay. And so Britain needs money to pay for war expenses. Okay, the debt that they have accumulated is tremendous. The country is suffering because of that, and something has to be done to raise revenue. All right. So what's going to happen is we're going to see new taxes issued. All right, because one of the aspects of that's going to happen not only in this time when the American colonies are dealing with it, but also when the United States as a young country is dealing with severe debt, is they're going to begin to tax the citizens. All right. And so what happens is Britain really begins to have what's considered to be a hands-on approach to the colonies. Because what they had done before was very hands-off. And a hands-off approach in terms of a country and its colonies is really what this is referring to, salutary neglect. Basically letting the colonies do what they want because the colonies were still making money for Britain. All this trade, all these agricultural cash crops, all that's good. But Britain is going to look at the American colonies as a source for revenue in the form of taxes. And these taxes are going to be unpopular. These taxes are going to be levied by a king and by a government that's 3,000 miles away. And you're going to start to see resentment and anger toward the British crown for these actions. And the big reason is because these colonies have been able to get away with nearly anything they wanted to for a very long time. And all of a sudden, it's going to change. The party's over. All right. And so you also see their government, their ability to self-govern themselves get kind of tightened up, and you get to see more encroachment and more hands-on approach by the British monarchy in the colonies, okay? But really, what's going to set it off to start is this right here, this proclamation or statement of 1763, an official statement by the crown. We're not going to have any colonial settlements allowed by the American colonists west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the reason why is that we're trying to attempt to remain peaceful with Native Americans, okay? Because the one thing that Britain cannot afford right now is a conflict. And we know historically when settlers move into an area that's heavily occupied by Native Americans, those two groups do not coexist very well. There's going to be conflict, okay? So we're going to have to really come back to this and see what the impact is going to be, because this is instantaneous. This is the same year that the war ends that Britain proclaims that settlements beyond the Appalachian Mountains will be restricted in order to prevent conflict with Native Americans. That's why the previous map showed you that Indian reserve set aside, okay? The other thing you have to think about is the fact that if France is really no longer a player in North America, the Native American allies are really limited now, because even Native Americans who have, and I'm doing air quotes, ally with the British, there's not a full trust there, because the British don't trust the natives and the natives don't trust the British. And what we're going to see over time is Native American land being lost. That's going to become a historical trend from this point forward. So really what we need to see here is culminating in this conclusion. So following the French and Indian War and the implementing of taxes to pay for the war, relations between Britain and the colonies were beginning to strain. And I'm not saying that 1763 with the proclamation, everybody's yelling independence, 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 but it's just one beginning situation in a domino effect that's going to begin to happen, in which these two groups, separated by 3,000 miles, the British government and their American colonies, the relationship is not going to continue to get better. It's going to get worse. All right. And that's going to lead to the colonies really considering whether a self-governed situation of being an independent country is going to work. Okay. And so again, we kind of see the official section of this, you know, the western boundary. This is essentially going to be off limits. That's the key here, these areas. So the restriction to this area is going to be in place. And what's going to happen is that Britain's going to send roughly 10,000 troops to the colonies to protect this border, because they're worried about France maybe reorganizing to try to claim land again. But ultimately, they're there for the protection of the colonies. And the colonies claim that there's no reason that they need to be protected, but Britain has to protect their investment, because all this land can't be occupied by both settlers and natives, because that's going to cause a conflict, okay? And so really, it comes down to these three themes, okay? The concern over Western settlement, the concern that trade is becoming of an issue, and it really is going to come down to this, because Britain's going to try to crack down on smuggling, because they need colonists to buy British goods and trade only with Britain. Okay. And really, this comes down to a concept called mercantilism. Okay. And mercantilism is basically the idea that, if you're a colonist and you live in a colony or an extension of a country, the only business you should be doing is with your mother country, with Britain. The problem is that the prices a lot of times that Britain sets are going to be higher than what you want to pay. So you're going to smuggle goods from the British, or excuse me, from the French or the Dutch or the Swedish because it's cheaper. And Britain doesn't want that because that money is going to those other countries instead of coming to the British government, which needs money more than anything now. Okay. So not only is the issue over land a problem, but making sure that colonists are following trade rules, mercantilistic rules, or mercantile laws, and trading with the British, that's going to be an issue. But to me, this is the thing, the finances. The British were in a massive amount of debt after the war, and then taxes were needed to raise money to pay for the war. And it shouldn't seem like that's out of the ordinary, but here's the thing. If you live in the American colonies, you're only paying a small fraction of what people in Britain are paying, 1/20th of the amount in taxes. Okay. So if I'm a native, British man living in London, and I hear about the whining and complaining of the colonies, I'm like, you have no clue what it's like to pay taxes or pay full taxes. So there's a lot of anger by people living in England when they hear about the concerns from the colonies that they shouldn't have to be paying these high taxes. Okay. And so one of the considerations we can have here is what do we do in this situation? Do we ask taxes to be increased on people living in England? Do we put taxes on articles of everyday use on people living in the colonies, knowing that they're going to have to buy them and then they'll have to pay a little bit more in taxes? Or do we have the colonists pay the same taxes as people living in England? These are all three difficult situations because they're not perfect solutions. Okay, so these are things ultimately that Britain is going to have to think on. And really, it comes down to the fact that this is going to be the solution that they're going to go with. Okay, this is not a possibility because then you anger the people living in England. And this is not a possibility because this could lead to a major, major, major revolt by the people in the colonies. And so what they decide to do is they go right ahead. The British Parliament begins to create laws or adjust existing laws to start raising revenue. They can't wait. This is not like a 10-year process of we'll think of it down the road. So what they start out with is a Sugar Act tax. And basically what they do is they renew a tax that existed basically on molasses, which is a substance, like a sweet substance that was desired in many places. It's just an everyday item of use, okay? And what they decided to do was not actually increase the tax, but they reduced it, okay? It was lowered. But there's a reason for that, because they think that if they can get people to pay a lower tax on goods like molasses, on sugar, on tea, on coffee, on wine, all encompassing, remember, everyday items that people want. If the tax is lowered, they'll be more willing to do that. But really, what it comes down to is this is a law that is created in Parliament in London and is handed down and expected to be followed in the colonies. Okay, this is a recurring theme, folks, that we are going to see time and time and time again. The laws are not being made in the colonial governments in North America. They're being made in Britain, okay? This is the reason why the tax is lowered. Britain says, we will lower the tax, but smuggling is going to be enforced to a higher penalty than ever before. Because if you're caught smuggling, you could potentially lose your right to a trial by jury, which was technically a right of all Englishmen under English law. And that kind of goes back all the way to the days of the Magna Carta, which was like the first major document that outlined important individual rights for citizens. But Britain's not really here to mess around. They need to enforce laws, they need to collect taxes, and they need to, in their minds, start getting the colonies to act up or act like they're supposed to and follow the laws, okay? And so even if the Stamp Act, or excuse me, the Sugar Act was controversial, this is the one that's going to set off the problems. This is it. Because this is a law that is only really implemented in the American colonies, okay? We have all these British troops that are going to be left in the colonies to protect the settlement. They are there to protect the colonists from an invasion of the French and protect from natives, okay? And this is something that is not going to be cheap. These British soldiers are not going to be working for free, and there's going to be an expectation that if they're there to protect the settlers, that the settlers are going to have to kind of fork over the bill, okay? And so what happens is Parliament says that if the colonies are going to be protected by the crown, the colonies need to share in the cost of the defense. Now, if you ask the common colonists, they're like, we're not worried about native invasions and we're not worried about the French coming back. So we don't need these soldiers, these outsiders occupying our communities. Let's face it, British troops don't like American colonists and American colonists don't like British troops. There's a very stark divide between these two groups of people because they're so different. British troops are from England. They don't consider colonists to be true Englishmen. And if you live in the colonies, your identity is becoming more and more as an American living in the American colonies than it is as being a British subject, okay? So here's what happens. A new kind of tax only on the colonies. This is the first tax that we're going to see that really is focused only on the American colonies and not anywhere else, okay? And so what this is going to do is it's going to raise money to pay for the burden of the cost of the British soldiers being in the colonies. And estimations at that time say it's about 300,000 pounds, because that's the currency used in England, per year to pay for the soldiers being in the colonies, okay? And so what's going to happen is colonists are going to have to buy stamped paper that is going to be used for newspapers, pamphlets, letters, playing cards, etc. And the paper is going to come from London. It's going to be stamped, and they're going to have to pay a tax. So in other words, if you are going to print a newspaper, the newspaper has to contain this unique stamp on the paper verifying that you have paid the tax to the crown. Okay, when I say the crown, I'm referencing the king, obviously, okay? This was something that people living in Britain had already paid in the past, but this law, this specific Stamp Act, is focusing only on the colonies, okay? This is a new law, new tax for them. And so this is what it looked like. You can see on this piece of paper, there's the tax, there's the stamp, okay? And so what we're going to have to look at here is really what is, sorry, I keep dancing around here. What is going to be the reaction? What is going to be the colonial reaction to this law that's going to ask them to pay a tax? Because this is going to tell us all that we need to know about what's to be expected down the road between these two groups, okay? And so after you view this video, there's going to be an assignment that I want you to start that you're going to have until Monday to turn in. And it's going to be focused on a set of primary sources talking about the reaction that people have from different groups based on this law. Because this is the law that really is going to set in motion a lot of change in terms of the relationship between the colonies and Britain. All right, I will talk to you all later. Thanks for joining us. Take care.